20 million people a year travel to a waterfall on the border between two countries to watch water fall over a cliff it has been falling over since the last ice age. Niagara Falls is the most visited natural wonder in North America, a single roar of water split across two nations, two currencies, two customs checkpoints, and, for more than a century, two entirely different visions of what the falls were for. On the Canadian side, the money-built casinos, observation towers, and a skyline that glows over the gorge at night. On the American side, the money mostly stopped arriving sometime after 1960, and it never fully came back. In 2025, something else happened, something that had nothing to do with waterfalls or geology. Canadian tourists stopped crossing the border in the numbers they used to. Cross-border travel from Canada into the United States fell by more than 25% that year, and by January of 2026, the decline had run for 13 consecutive months. The city of Niagara Falls, New York, has lost 54% of its population since the year its skyline peaked. This is the story of how a waterfall became a border, how a border became an industrial city, how an industrial city poisoned itself, and how, in the end, the falls kept falling long after almost everyone had stopped coming to watch. It is not primarily a story about geology, although geology started it. It is a story about what a place becomes when three different generations of people, honeymooners, factory owners, and border agents, each decide in turn that this particular stretch of river belongs to them. The first written account of Niagara Falls by a European came from a French priest with a talent for exaggeration. In 1678, Father Louis Hennepin, a Recollect missionary traveling with the explorer René Robert Cavelier de La Salle, stood at the edge of the gorge and recorded what he saw. He would later publish his account in a book called A New Discovery, and the description he gave the falls, the sound, the mist rising like smoke from the river, the sheer improbable scale of it, traveled back across the Atlantic and did what descriptions of extraordinary natural sights have always done. It made people want to see it themselves. For more than a century after Hennepin, the falls remained remote, difficult to reach, a wonder mostly known through his written account and the engravings that followed. That began to change once the land around the falls filled in with settlers and the infrastructure of a young country started reaching toward the border. The moment that turned Niagara Falls from a landmark into a destination arrived in 1804, and it involved the family of the most powerful man in Europe. Jerome Bonaparte, the youngest brother of Napoleon, traveled to Niagara Falls on his honeymoon that year. He was 19. His marriage would not survive contact with his brother's ambitions. Napoleon annulled it and never recognized it. But the trip itself left something behind that outlasted the marriage by more than 2 centuries. Jerome Bonaparte's honeymoon at Niagara Falls became the founding story of a tradition. Word spread that a Bonaparte had chosen the falls as the place to begin a marriage, and other newlyweds followed. Niagara Falls became known as the honeymoon capital, a title that would define the town's identity and its tourism economy for generations. Long before anyone thought to build a hydroelectric plant or a chemical refinery on the banks of the Niagara River, the falls were already selling something intangible. The idea that this particular place, with its noise and its mist and its impossible scale, was where a life together should start. Through the 19th century, the railroads did what railroads did to every remote wonder in North America. They made it reachable. As rail lines extended toward the Niagara frontier, tourists who once needed days of difficult travel could arrive in hours. Hotels went up along the gorge. Guides offered tours down to the base of the falls, along the rapids, out onto the rock ledges where the spray soaked through wool coats. The town of Niagara Falls, New York, incorporated as a village and grew alongside the railroads. Its economy built almost entirely on the fact that people wanted to stand near the loudest, largest waterfall most of them would ever see in their lives. The town that grew up along the gorge in those decades was, in a sense, always performing for an audience. Hotels along the American Bluff advertised unobstructed views. Guides sold tickets for descents to the base of the falls, where visitors, wrapped in rented oilskins against the spray, could feel the concussion of the water in their chests before they heard it in their ears. Honeymooners arrived by the trainload, following the tradition Jerome Bonaparte had unknowingly started, and the town's hotel owners understood exactly what they were selling. Not just a view, but a story a newly married couple could tell for the rest of their lives, that they had stood where the Bonapartes stood, that they had heard what Father Hennepin heard. The falls did not need to be improved upon. They only needed to be reached, and every railroad spike driven closer to the gorge made that easier. The population numbers from this period tell the story of a place catching fire. In 1900, Niagara Falls, New York had 19,457 residents. That was already a functioning small city, built on tourism and the early stirrings of industry. 20 years later, in 1920, the population had nearly tripled to 50,760. By 1930, it had grown again to 75,460. In 3 decades, the town had multiplied itself nearly fourfold. Almost no American city grew at that rate during that period without a single industry driving it, and Niagara Falls had too. Tourism brought people to look. Industry brought people to work. And by the early 20th century, both engines were running at full speed at the same time, feeding off the same geographic accident, an enormous volume of moving water falling a great distance in one specific place. That geographic accident was about to become the most valuable industrial resource in North America, and the story of what happened next, the electricity, the factories, the chemical companies, the decades of prosperity, and the poison that came with them, is the story of how Niagara Falls stopped being only a honeymoon destination and became something else entirely. A city built on power. The water that had drawn Father Hennepin's wonder and Jerome Bonaparte's honeymoon was, by the final years of the 19th century, understood by engineers as something else. An almost unimaginable quantity of falling mass, moving at a scale that dwarfed anything a human engine could produce. In 1895, the world's first large-scale hydroelectric power station opened at Niagara Falls. It was not the first attempt to harness the river's power. Small mills and local generators had tapped the current for decades, but it was the first time anyone had built a plant capable of generating and transmitting electricity on an industrial scale, using the falls as the engine. The station drew water above the falls, ran it through turbines, and sent the power out. The question that remained was how far that power could travel before it became useless. The man who answered that question was Nikola Tesla. In 1896, using the alternating current system he had championed against Thomas Edison's direct current, Tesla's technology transmitted electricity from the Niagara Falls power station to the city of Buffalo, New York, 20-some miles away. It worked. Alternating current could travel that distance without the catastrophic losses that had made direct current impractical for anything beyond a few city blocks. Understand what that meant for the engineers watching the demonstration. Before Niagara, the accepted wisdom in the electrical industry was that power generation had to happen close to where the power was used, because direct current lost too much strength over distance to be practical for anything beyond a few city blocks. A factory needed its own generator, or a generator nearby. Niagara Falls broke that assumption in a single transmission. If alternating current could travel more than 20 miles from a waterfall to a city and still arrive strong enough to run streetlights and streetcars, there was no obvious ceiling on how far it could eventually travel. The success at Niagara did more than light up Buffalo. It settled the war of the currents in Tesla and Westinghouse's favor and established the template that would electrify the rest of the country. Niagara Falls was no longer just a spectacle. It was a power plant, and its output was about to summon an entire industry to move in and set up shop next to the source. The generating capacity at Niagara, across the stations that eventually rose on both the American and Canadian sides of the river, reached a combined maximum of 2.4 million kilowatts, That is a number that meant, in practical terms, cheap and abundant electricity, available in a quantity that almost no other location in North America could match. And cheap, abundant electricity is exactly what heavy industry needs. Electrochemical and electrometallurgical processes, ones that used enormous current to break down raw materials, refine metals, and synthesize chemical compounds, required power in quantities that were prohibitively expensive almost everywhere else. At Niagara Falls, the power was sitting right there, falling over a cliff, waiting to be converted into current. Companies began arriving to build plants along the river, drawn by the same physics that had drawn tourists for 2 centuries, except now the falls were valued not for what they looked like, but for what they could generate. What made Niagara Falls unusual among American industrial towns was that its power source was visible. In Pittsburgh, in Youngstown, in the mill towns of the Ohio Valley, the fuel that ran the furnaces arrived by rail car or by barge, hauled in from someplace else, coal dug out of a hillside 100 miles away. In Niagara Falls, the power source was standing in plain view of the Honeymoon hotels, roaring day and night, visible from the same bluffs where couples had their wedding photographs taken. The town's 2 economies, tourism and heavy industry, were not separated by geography. They were separated only by which direction a visitor happened to be looking. Over the following decades, the chemical industry became the backbone of the American side's economy in a way that tourism alone never had been. By 1970, 9 major chemical companies operated in Niagara Falls, New York, employing 5,267 people between them. That number, more than 5,000 chemical industry jobs in a single mid-sized city, represented an economic engine that touched nearly every household in town, directly or indirectly. Factory wages fed grocery stores, hardware stores, movie theaters, church collection plates. Whole neighborhoods existed because a father, a husband, a son had work at one of the plants along the river. The city's identity split cleanly down the middle. It was a place where honeymooners came to see the falls, and it was a place where chemical workers clocked in at shift change. For decades, both halves of that identity fed the same tax base, the same school system, the same downtown. The population figures track this dual boom precisely. The city that had 75,460 residents in 1930 continued climbing through the middle of the 20th century. By 1950, the population stood at 90,872, and in 1960, Niagara Falls, New York reached its all-time peak, 102,394 residents. That is the number against which everything that came after has to be measured. A city of over 100,000 people, built on electricity and tourism in roughly equal measure, sitting at the edge of one of the most famous natural landmarks on the continent, with a downtown full of hotels, theaters, department stores, and a skyline of smokestacks rising along the river a few miles from the honeymoon suites. It is worth sitting with that peak for a moment, because 1960 was not just a high point, it was a hinge. Everything the city had built, the hydroelectric infrastructure, the chemical plants, the tourist economy, the population growth that had run essentially uninterrupted for 60 years, was standing at its absolute maximum extension in that year. And underneath the growth, underneath the factories and the jobs and the tax revenue, something had been accumulating for 2 decades that nobody outside a handful of company officials fully understood yet. It was not sitting on a shelf. It was sitting in the ground, in a half-finished canal a few miles from downtown, and it had been going there since the 1940s. The canal had a name. It had been dug decades earlier by a man named William T. Love, who wanted to build a model industrial city powered by a channel connecting the upper and lower sections of the Niagara River. Love's project collapsed for reasons that had nothing to do with chemistry. Financing dried up, the economics never worked, and the partially dug canal sat abandoned, an unfinished ditch a few miles from the falls. It sat empty for years. Then, starting in the 1940s, a company called Hooker Chemical began using the old canal bed as a disposal site. Between the 1940s and the early 1950s, Hooker Chemical dumped 19,800 metric tons of chemical waste into the abandoned Love Canal. Drums of industrial byproduct, some of it identifiable, much of it not, were sealed into the ground and covered over. In 1953, Hooker Chemical sold the covered-over land to the local school board for $1, with a deed that disclosed the presence of buried chemical waste and disclaimed liability for whatever happened afterward. A school was built on top of it. Houses went up around the school. Families moved in. Children played in yards that sat directly above tens of thousands of tons of buried industrial chemicals, and for 2.5 decades, nothing about the neighborhood looked unusual from the surface. What happened underground did not stay underground forever. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the steel drums buried in the old canal bed corroded. The chemicals inside began to migrate, seeping upward through the soil, following the water table, working their way toward basements and sewer lines and the crawl spaces beneath the elementary school built directly on top of the old dump site. Residents began noticing things that did not have an obvious explanation. Strange odors, sludge surfacing in backyards after heavy rain, corroded patches on the sides of homes closest to the old canal. Children came home from playing outside with chemical burns. For years, complaints to the city and the company went nowhere, treated as isolated nuisances rather than the visible edge of something much larger. There is an old, uncomfortable pattern in American industrial history, where the same feature that makes a location valuable for manufacturing, cheap land, proximity to power, distance from the scrutiny of a larger city, also makes it attractive as a place to hide the byproducts nobody wants to look at. Niagara Falls had all three. Cheap land existed in the form of an abandoned, half-dug canal nobody had found a use for since William T. Love's development scheme collapsed decades earlier. Proximity to power meant chemical plants had every reason to operate nearby in the first place. And distance from scrutiny meant a company could seal drums into a canal bed, cover it with dirt, and sell the land to a school board for $1. And for 25 years, almost nobody outside the company asked hard questions about what exactly had been buried there. The scale of what was underneath the Love Canal neighborhood became public in the most consequential way on August 1, 1978, when investigators confirmed what residents had been describing for years. 82 different chemical compounds were identified in the soil and groundwater beneath the neighborhood, 11 of them known or suspected carcinogens, percolating upward through basements, seeping into storm drains, showing up in the crawl space beneath the elementary school where children spent their days. It became a national story within weeks. Love Canal turned into the reference point for an entire category of environmental disaster: the abandoned industrial dump beneath the unsuspecting neighborhood, the sealed drums that outlasted the promises made about them, the children's playground built on poison. President Jimmy Carter declared a federal emergency, the first time such a declaration had been made for something other than a natural disaster. Hundreds of families were eventually relocated, their homes purchased and abandoned, entire blocks of the neighborhood fenced off and left to the weeds. The Love Canal disaster became a driving force behind the creation of the federal Superfund program, the law that still governs how the country identifies and cleans up contaminated industrial sites. There is a particular cruelty in how Love Canal unfolded that separates it from an ordinary industrial accident. This was not a sudden explosion, a single bad day that a community could point to and mourn and then begin to move past. It was a slow seep, a problem that had already been sitting in the ground for 2.5 decades before anyone with the authority to act treated it as an emergency. Children who had grown up playing in yards above the old canal bed were already adults by the time the 82 compounds were confirmed in 1978. Families had already raised children, buried grandparents, celebrated anniversaries in houses that sat, unknowingly, on top of tens of thousands of tons of buried industrial waste. The disaster did not arrive. It had already been there the entire time, and the only thing that changed in August of 1978 was that everyone finally found out. For the city of Niagara Falls, New York, the consequences went beyond the relocated families and the fenced-off blocks. The scandal attached itself permanently to the city's name. For 100 years, the words Niagara Falls had summoned honeymoons and hydroelectric marvels and one of the natural wonders of the world. After 1978, for a significant portion of the American public, the words also summoned buried chemical drums, cancer clusters, and a school built on a toxic dump. That association did not fade quickly, and it did not fade cheaply. Companies that had once been proud to list a Niagara Falls address began quietly relocating operations elsewhere. Insurance costs for anything built near the old industrial corridor rose. Real estate near the affected neighborhoods became close to worthless, and the stigma bled outward into parts of the city that had nothing directly to do with the canal itself. The chemical industry that had employed 5,267 people across 9 companies in 1970 began contracting through the 1970s and 1980s as plants closed, consolidated, or moved to jurisdictions with less regulatory scrutiny and less press attention. The jobs that had built entire neighborhoods on the American side began disappearing. And unlike the tourism trade, they did not come back in a different form. They simply stopped. By the time the cleanup crews finished capping the old canal and the relocated families had scattered into other towns, the city of Niagara Falls, New York was a fundamentally different place than it had been at its 1960 peak. The factories that remained were smaller, fewer, and warier. The chemical industry, once the backbone of the local economy, had become the reason outsiders hesitated to invest, to visit, to build. And the falls themselves, the actual waterfall, the reason any of this had started, kept doing exactly what they had always done. Falling, roaring, drawing a crowd of tourists who mostly had no idea that a few miles inland, an old abandoned canal had spent 30 years leaking chemicals into a neighborhood that no longer existed. What makes the story of Niagara Falls unusual among American industrial cities is that it did not simply decline, it split. 2 cities share the name Niagara Falls, one in New York, one directly across the gorge in Ontario, Canada, and for most of the 20th century they had risen together, twin beneficiaries of the same waterfall, the same railroads, the same honeymoon tradition. After Love Canal, after the chemical contraction, after the population began to hollow out on the American side, the 2 cities' paths diverged sharply, and they have never converged again. The population collapse on the American side is not a single event. It is a 5-decade slide, and the numbers trace it with brutal precision. The city that peaked at 102,394 residents in 1960 had fallen to 85,615 by 1970, a drop of nearly 17,000 people in a single decade, the decade that included the Love Canal contamination becoming public, and the first wave of chemical plant contractions. The slide did not stop. By 1990, the population stood at 61,840, less than 2/3 of its peak. By 2020, it had fallen further still, to 48,560. Compare that final number to the 1960 peak of 102,394, and the arithmetic is stark. The city has lost more than half of its population, a decline of 54% from its high point. Whole residential blocks that once housed chemical workers and tourism industry employees sit today with more vacant lots than occupied houses. Storefronts downtown that once served a population of 100,000 now serve a fraction of that number, and many simply closed rather than shrink to fit. The economic data from the American side confirms what the population numbers suggest. The median household income in Niagara Falls, New York, stands at $49,101, well below both the state and national averages. The poverty rate stands at 23.72%, nearly 1 in 4 residents living below the poverty line, in a city that sits, quite literally, within walking distance of one of the most visited natural landmarks in the world. That juxtaposition, extreme poverty a few blocks from a UNESCO-level tourist attraction that draws millions of visitors a year, is the defining absurdity of the American side's modern condition. The falls generate enormous tourism revenue. Very little of it appears to reach the neighborhoods a short walk from the observation decks. A visitor stepping off a tour bus at Niagara Falls State Park sees mist, rock, and the same overwhelming volume of water that impressed Father Hennepin in 1678. A short drive from that park, the visitor would pass boarded storefronts, vacant residential lots where houses once stood, and a school district trying to serve a shrinking, increasingly low-income population with a shrinking tax base. Both scenes belong to the same city. Almost none of the tourists see the second one. The gap between the two Niagara Falls is not an accident of geography. It is the accumulated result of 50 years of divergent decisions. One side reinvesting tourism revenue into new attractions and infrastructure, the other side absorbing an industrial contamination scandal, losing its manufacturing tax base, and never finding a replacement industry large enough to fill the hole the chemical companies left behind. Across the gorge, the Canadian side took a fundamentally different approach to the same asset, and the divergence in outcomes over the following decades illustrates just how much civic strategy can shape what happens around a shared natural wonder. Niagara Falls, Ontario invested heavily and consistently in tourism infrastructure that went far beyond the waterfall itself. Casinos rose along the parkway above the gorge, observation towers, indoor entertainment complexes, hotel chains, chain restaurants, and a dense corridor of attractions built specifically to extract multiple days of spending from every visitor rather than a single afternoon. The Canadian side leaned into spectacle, into neon, into the version of Niagara Falls that treats the waterfall as an anchor attraction surrounded by a purpose-built entertainment district rather than the entirety of the destination. It worked, at least in terms of the numbers that measure tourism success. As of 2023, the Canadian side drew approximately 12.3 million visitors compared to 9.5 million on the American side that same year. Visitor spending told an even starker story. American side tourism spending in 2023 totaled approximately $1.08 billion, while Canadian side spending reached roughly 2.5 billion Canadian dollars, more than double, even before accounting for the exchange rate. Stand on the Canadian bluff above the gorge today, and the skyline behind you looks like a smaller, gorge-side version of a casino district, towers with observation decks, hotel chains stacked one against the next, restaurants with floor-to-ceiling windows angled toward the mist. Cross the Rainbow Bridge to the American side, and the skyline flattens out almost immediately into low commercial buildings, some occupied, some not. A downtown built for a population of over 100,000, now serving a population less than half that size. The waterfall in the middle of the gorge is the same waterfall on both sides. The economic ecosystem that grew up around it is not, and has not been for decades. The reasons for that gap are not mysterious. The Canadian side offers the more photogenic view of the falls, the Horseshoe Falls, the larger and more dramatic of the two main sections, sits almost entirely on the Canadian side of the border, meaning visitors who want the classic postcard image are naturally pulled toward Ontario, regardless of which country they started their trip from. But geography alone does not explain a gap this wide. Decades of sustained investment in entertainment infrastructure, hotel capacity, and destination marketing on the Canadian side built an ecosystem designed to keep visitors spending money for 2 or 3 days rather than a single afternoon. The American side, weighed down by its industrial legacy, its contamination stigma, and its shrinking population and tax base, could not match that level of sustained reinvestment. Every dollar the city didn't have to spend on new attractions was a dollar it needed just to maintain basic services for a population that kept shrinking and a poverty rate that kept climbing. The pandemic delivered a brutal, if temporary, reminder of how dependent the entire binational tourism economy had become on cross-border movement. In 2020, American side visitor numbers collapsed to just 5.97 million, roughly a 40% drop from pre-pandemic levels, as border restrictions between the United States and Canada shut down the casual cross-border day trips that had always made up a significant share of total visitation. Hotels that depended on Canadian guests sat empty. Restaurants that depended on Canadian lunch crowds closed for months. The recovery, when it came in the following years, brought the visitor numbers back up toward their pre-pandemic range, 9.5 million on the American side and 12.3 million on the Canadian side by 2023. It looked, for a moment, like the border had reopened and the old patterns had resumed. They had not resumed for long. What the pandemic revealed as a temporary shock, cross-border tourism could be switched off entirely by a border closure, was about to reveal itself as something more permanent. Starting in 2025, without any pandemic, without any border closure, without any natural disaster, the cross-border tourism that both sides of Niagara Falls depended on began collapsing again. This time, the cause was not a virus. It was politics, and unlike a pandemic, nobody could put a date on when it would end. The numbers from 2025 and into 2026 describe a decline steep enough that tourism officials on both sides of the border started using words like crisis rather than slowdown. Canadian resident return trips to the United States fell by more than 25% in 2025 compared to the year before. That is not a soft dip attributable to normal seasonal variation or a temporary exchange rate fluctuation. A 25% drop in cross-border visitation, sustained across an entire year, represents a fundamental change in behavior among the exact population that had underwritten a meaningful share of the region's tourism economy since Jerome Bonaparte's honeymoon 2 centuries earlier. The decline showed up most visibly in the most mundane measurement available: cars crossing the bridges. By late 2025, the number of Canadians driving across the border into the United States had fallen by more than 30%. Car crossings are the plainest possible proxy for day trip tourism. The Canadian family driving over for an afternoon at the falls, dinner at an American restaurant, a stop at an outlet mall on the way home. That kind of casual, spontaneous cross-border movement, the type that costs nothing to plan and requires no advance commitment, is also the type most sensitive to friction, whether that friction comes from long lines at customs, unfavorable currency conditions, new tariffs, or simply a change in how welcome Canadians feel crossing into the United States. When car crossings fall by more than 30%, it means the spontaneous, casual trips, exactly the trips that used to sustain restaurants and gift shops and gas stations near the border, are the ones disappearing first and fastest. Every business model along both sides of the gorge had been built, consciously or not, on the assumption that the border was a formality rather than a barrier. A Canadian family in Toronto or Hamilton could decide on a Saturday morning to drive down for the afternoon, cross at the Rainbow Bridge or the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge, spend a few hours and a few $100s, and be home for dinner. That kind of frictionless, spontaneous cross-border movement had underwritten restaurants, gift shops, small hotels, and gas stations on both sides for generations. It required no advance planning, no visa, nothing beyond a valid passport and the will to get in the car. Once that spontaneity started to feel like a risk, once crossing the border started to feel like a decision loaded with political weight rather than a routine errand, the day trip economy that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and a global pandemic began contracting in a way that had no comparable precedent. The decline did not level off, it compounded. Statistics Canada data showed that by January 2026, Canadian resident return trips from the United States had fallen 22% compared to the same month a year earlier, and that January figure represented the 13th consecutive month of year-over-year decline. 13 months in a row, not a single bad quarter, not a seasonal anomaly, but more than a full year of sustained, uninterrupted contraction in the single tourism relationship that both sides of Niagara Falls had built their post-industrial economies around. Local visitor centers on the American side reported foot traffic down 25%. Businesses that had spent years positioning themselves around cross-border day trippers, gift shops, casual restaurants, small hotels catering to Canadian weekend visitors, found themselves serving a customer base that had simply stopped showing up in the numbers they used to rely on. The causes, as reported by tourism industry analysts tracking the collapse, were not mysterious or hard to trace. Tensions between the United States and Canada over trade policy, including new tariffs affecting cross-border commerce, combined with mutual travel advisories that each government issued warning its citizens about conditions in the other country, created a climate in which the casual cross-border trip, the spontaneous drive over to see the falls or grab dinner, no longer felt like a simple errand. It felt like a decision freighted with politics that had nothing to do with waterfalls or honeymoons or hydroelectric history. New tariffs on goods moving between the two countries raised the cost of the cross-border shopping trips that had always been part of the appeal. The outlet malls, the gas stations, the grocery runs that Canadian visitors folded into a day at the falls. Mutual travel advisories, each government cautioning its own citizens about conditions across the border, did something tariffs alone could not. They introduced a psychological hesitation into a trip that had never required one. A family deciding whether to drive down for the afternoon was no longer just checking the weather and the bridge traffic. They were weighing news coverage about detentions, delays, and diplomatic friction that had nothing to do with them personally, but made the whole idea of crossing feel less like a Saturday outing and more like a gamble. Canadians who had crossed the bridge without a second thought for decades began thinking twice. Many decided not to go at all. The tourism industry on both sides of the gorge, an industry that had survived Love Canal, survived the population collapse, survived the 2020 pandemic shutdown, found itself facing a decline driven by something it had no ability to fix through better marketing or new attractions. The political relationship between the two countries, whose shared border happened to run directly through the middle of one of the most famous waterfalls on Earth. For the American side in particular, a region already carrying 54% population loss since 1960, a median household income of $49,101, and a poverty rate above 23%, the collapse in cross-border day trip tourism landed on an economy with almost no cushion left to absorb it. The Canadian side, wealthier, more diversified, less dependent on any single American visitor segment, could weather a 25% decline in one tourist category more easily than a city that had already lost most of its industrial base and half its population. But even the Canadian side, with its casinos and its towers and its billions in accumulated tourism investment, felt the drop. A waterfall that draws 20 million visitors a year cannot lose a meaningful fraction of its cross-border traffic without every business along both sides of the gorge noticing the difference in their receipts. The falls themselves, through every chapter of this story, did not change at all. The same volume of water that Father Hennepin described in 1678, that Jerome Bonaparte's bride watched in 1804, that powered Tesla's transmission line to Buffalo in 1896, that turns turbines capable of generating a combined 2.4 million kilowatts today, continues falling at essentially the same rate it always has. The Niagara River does not know about tariffs. It does not know about travel advisories. It does not know that the city named after it once had 102,394 residents and now has less than half that number, or that a canal a few miles from its banks absorbed 19,800 metric tons of chemical waste that took decades to surface and a national scandal to clean up. The water simply falls, the way it has fallen since the glaciers retreated, indifferent to every human system that has organized itself around trying to capture, sell, or survive off its edge. 3.5 centuries is a long enough span that it is worth asking what, if anything, stayed constant across all of it. Not the population, which rose from nothing to over 100,000 and then fell back below 50,000. Not the industry, which arrived with Tesla's transmission line and mostly departed after Love Canal made the address radioactive in the public imagination, if not literally. Not even the border itself, which has shifted in meaning from a formality separating two friendly neighbors to, in the space of a single year, a friction point serious enough to cut cross-border visitation by more than a quarter. The only constant is the water, and the water was never impressed by any of it. The honeymoons, the turbines, the buried drums, the casinos, the tariffs. It just kept falling. What has changed, again and again, across 3.5 centuries, is what humans decided the falls were for. A wonder to be recorded by a French missionary. A honeymoon destination for a 19-year-old Bonaparte. A power source capable of running an entire industrial corridor. A dumping ground convenient enough that a chemical company could bury tens of thousands of tons of waste and sell the land for $1. A binational tourism economy split between a side that reinvested and thrived and a side that contracted and emptied. And now, a border crossing whose traffic rises and falls not with the seasons, but with trade negotiations and diplomatic tension between two countries that have shared this waterfall and disagreed about almost everything else concerning it for longer than either has existed in its current form. Niagara Falls, New York today is a city of roughly 47,000 people, down from a peak of over 102,000, sitting beside one of the most visited natural wonders on the continent, unable to fully convert that proximity into the recovery its population and its poverty statistics suggest it badly needs. 20 million people still travel to see the falls every year, combined across both sides of the border. But the composition of that crowd, where they come from, how long they stay, how much they spend, and, increasingly, whether they come from Canada at all, has become as unstable as anything in the city's long and complicated history. The chemical companies came and mostly left. The population came and mostly left. And now, for the first time in the modern era, a measurable and sustained share of the tourists are staying away too, not because the falls have gotten any less spectacular, but because the two countries that share them have, for the moment, made it harder to feel like crossing the bridge is worth the trouble. The water does not care. It has never cared. It fell before there was a border, and it will fall after whatever is currently straining the relationship between Ottawa and Washington has been resolved, forgotten, or replaced by some new dispute nobody has thought of yet. That indifference is, in its own way, the most honest thing left standing in Niagara Falls. Everything else, the honeymoon suites, the chemical plants, the observation towers, the visitor centers reporting a 25% drop in foot traffic, was built by people trying to make something lasting out of a waterfall that was never going to need any of it. The falls were never the thing that was fragile. The city built around them was. If this is the first video of ours you have come across, there is a wider pattern here worth noticing. American towns that bet everything on a single asset, a waterfall, an airport, a ranch, a mine, and then had to live with what happened when the world around that asset changed and the town did not change with it. We have told a few of these stories already, and we will keep telling more. If you want to see how a different American destination built an entire identity around a different kind of collapse, that story is sitting in the video linked on screen now, and it is worth your time. For now, leave a comment about what you think the American side of Niagara Falls should do next, because after 3.5 centuries of the falls outlasting everyone's plans for them, that question does not have an obvious answer.